Thank you so much for tuning in to this lecture, Bearing God's Name, the Old Testament basis for the church's mission. Our presenter today is Dr. Carmen Imes. Dr. Imes, we are delighted to have you join us today as we consider this wonderful topic together today. I'll begin with just a brief introduction of Dr. Imes. She is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Prairie College up in Alberta, Canada. She and her husband have served as missionaries overseas, and they have 3 children. And I think for most of us, Dr. Imes is best known as the author of Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. And I just want to give sort of a personal introduction to this book and say that I don't know in recent years another book quite like this one that almost everybody I've talked to who is interested in the realm of biblical studies or theology, I'll mention this book and they'll either say, oh, I just read that, or I'm about to read that, or I want to read that, or I've heard great things about that, or something along those lines. And I think that speaks to Dr. Imes' ability both to engage at a high level of biblical academic scholarship, but also make that accessible so that almost anyone can enter in and see not only the importance of the subject, but the relevance to their lives and to their walk with Jesus. And I think we're going to see that again today. And so I'm so delighted that we have this opportunity. Those of us that have enjoyed Bearing God's Name are looking forward to Dr. Imes' next book, Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. And in that respect, 2022 can't come soon enough. Look forward to the publication of that as well. If you've enjoyed Bearing God's Name, or today, if you want to follow up with Dr. Imes, I would recommend to you her blog, carmenjoyimes.blogspot.com, or check out her YouTube channel, which can be found through her name. And each Tuesday, she leads a Torah Tuesday, just a short lecture, usually 5 to 10 minutes, and a wonderful way to engage further with the biblical text. And so I recommend that to you as well. Let me just also say, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end of our time today, we have 2 more lectures coming up next Monday, February 1st, and then the following Monday, February 8th. Again, I'll say more about those at the end of our time today, but I certainly hope that you will plan on joining us for those as well. Then let me also say, just as we get started today, you will have the opportunity to ask some questions today. If there's anything that you would like to ask Dr. Imes about, I invite you to either use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can type up that question, and during the end of our time today, I will ask those questions. Or if you would like to come on screen and ask your question, simply type into the chat box. Let us know that you have a question, and we'll make sure that you get to come on screen and ask your question to Dr. Imes that way. We're also, at the end of this time, going to post a link to a survey into the chat box, and we would certainly appreciate if you would take a few moments and fill that out for us. We certainly value your opinion and want to use that as we plan future events moving forward. So we thank you for doing that. I'm just going to pray for us, and then I'll turn things over to Dr. Imes. Let's pray. Father God, we do thank you so much for this day and for this time. We pray, Lord, that you would be with us here in this next hour and a half, Lord, and that you would speak to us. Lord, give us a greater understanding of who you are and what it means, Lord, to bear your name, to be your image, to be disciples of your Son, Jesus Christ. Equip and anoint us, we pray, Lord, for we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Dr. Imes.
Amen. All right. Well, it is really wonderful to be with all of you this morning. And I am looking forward to sharing with you. Many of you have already read my book or heard podcast interviews or seen or heard enough about this book to get an idea of what it's about. So for those of you who haven't, I'm going to be giving sort of a brief overview of the core things that I try to communicate. But even if you have read the book, I'm adding in some new content today about being God's image, because one of the questions I'm asked more than any other is how being God's image relates to bearing God's name. So that's the book that I'm working on now, as Judd already mentioned, being God's image, why creation still matters. And so I decided to weave a bit of that into today's lecture as well. I am, again, delighted for this invitation. Thank you to Nick DeFrancisco for the invitation, to Judd for helping moderate, for Colleen, who's working behind the scenes on the technology. Just really grateful for all of their work to make this possible. We live in a polarized world. Just a few weeks ago, I was giving a similar lecture to the staff of a nonprofit ministry, and little did I know that at the same time there was an insurrection going on at the U.S. Capitol building involving crosses and U.S. flags and Trump signs and Bibles. So this is a really interesting time for the church to be thinking about what God's name mean to engage in the public square, in politics, and in any other venue as we together figure out the best way to overcome this pandemic and how to navigate it as the church. We're all dealing with lots of new challenges and a steep learning curve. So I would just invite you to think together with me today about how does the Old Testament inform our sense of identity and vocation as Christians. I'm going to argue today that Christians cannot know who we are or what we're called to do in the world without paying close attention to the Old Testament storyline. And we're going to begin that conversation with Genesis 1. And my computer's, there we go, not responding. Now it is. All right, so we're going to begin with talking about what does it mean to be God's image. And there are three aspects that I'll draw out of these very familiar verses of Genesis chapter 1. And if you'd like more on this, you can, as Judd mentioned, you can tune into my Torah Tuesday videos on YouTube. I'm in the middle of a series on the image of God right now. Genesis 1:26 reads, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." This is the climactic moment in God's creative work in Genesis chapter 1. It's the creation of humans. And so if we want to know what does it mean to be human, we need to go back to this text and press into it and ask, what is this telling me about what it means to be human? What is included in that? What is essential in that? And so the first key word we encounter is the word image, and we'll consider together what does it mean to be God's image. But first, finishing the passage. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. If the first verse tells us about the plan of God to create humans so that they may rule, so this is God's intention to make humanity, verse 27 gives us the sense of scope for who is included in this plan that God has. And I think it's hugely significant that what we have is male and female made in the image of God. The woman, when God creates woman, she's not like a second-class citizen. She is side by side with the man, both together made in God's image. So whatever the plan entails, whatever the purpose is of being made in God's image, it's shared equally by men and women. And verse 28 gives us the implications of what it means to be God's image with this blessing. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." One thing that I think is really significant about this verse, as I've spent time with it, is to notice that although the man and the woman are going to be fruitful and multiply, they're going to fill the earth and subdue it, it does not say they are to subdue each other. Humans were not designed to rule over or subdue each other. We were designed to work side by side to accomplish God's task. And so the ruling is over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and every living creature that moves along the ground. That is significant. But what does it mean to be an image, the image of God? For most of us, the word image is quite intangible, seems intangible, like a digital image or projection or an idea. But in ancient times, an image was something quite concrete. So here is a statue of the king of Guzan, Hadad Yithel, and this is known as an image, using the Akkadian word salmu, which is just like the Hebrew word selam. It's a sister word of the Hebrew word selam, which means image. If a king went out and conquered a new territory, a king can't be everywhere at once. So the king would need to have a way of demonstrating his sovereignty over the new territory that he conquered. And so very often ancient kings would set up statues of themselves as a symbol of their presence and their sovereignty over that domain. And that's how this image of the king of Guzan functioned. And I think it's also how the image in Genesis 1 is meant to function. God makes humans as his image, not in some sort of abstract sense, as though we share certain characteristics with God. Many people have suggested this is our intellect or our capacity for relationship or our moral compass. These things are true about humans. We do have self-consciousness and intellect and capacity for relationship and a moral compass, but those things are not what make us God's image. It's really just our bodies. Our bodies make us God's image. Being human in and of itself without any particular ability is what identifies us as of God himself out the edges of his realm to signal to everyone else that he's in charge. So God puts humans in creation and puts us there as a signal or symbol of his rulership over all creation. And then he tells us to carry out that rule in partnership with him. Here's an example of an image from an ancient temple, an Egyptian temple. The image would be this concrete representation of the deity. So I showed you an example of a concrete representation of a king, but of course, gods also had concrete representations. Nobody thought that statue actually was the god that it represented, but it was a stand-in, a way of focusing attention on the presence of that God and the sovereignty that God had over a particular domain, just like with kings. So here's an Egyptian temple with an image in it. And the takeaway from this is that a tselem, or image, is something concrete. It's a concrete statue or idol. Now, when we compare ancient Near Eastern temples to the Israelite temple or tabernacle, we find a striking difference. Here's an artist's rendition of the Israelite tabernacle, and you'll see that in the most holy place on the far left of the screen there, the most holy place, there is the Ark of the Covenant, which has some cherubim on top, but there is no image or statue of Yahweh, because he's asked his people not to make images of himself. He does not want to be represented by wood or stone. And if you're familiar with the Bible Project and their fantastic videos that explain the Bible and give us access to biblical themes and ideas, then you'll hear Tim Mackey say, God asks his people not to make an image because he's already made an image of himself. And that is all of us. God's already made humans to stand in and represent his presence and his dominion over the earth. So he doesn't want an image of wood or of stone. He expects that we will be mediating his presence throughout creation. Now, many have wrestled with the question of whether the image was lost or destroyed or damaged or diminished in some way when Adam and Eve rebelled against God in the garden. And so I just want to direct your attention to Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God, created them male and female, and sort of recapping what we read in Genesis 1. And he named them mankind when they were created. Now, when Adam had lived 130 years, he imaged, and he named him Seth. What I love about this passage is that, to me, it clarifies two things. One, it indicates to me that the image has not been lost, destroyed, damaged, or diminished in any way, because the author is clearly connecting us back to Genesis 1 and saying, just like when God made humans in his likeness and blessed them, just like that happened, now this new thing happened, that Adam had a son in his likeness and his image and named him Seth. So I think it's affirming that the image hasn't been lost, even though the fall has happened, but it's also giving us an analogy to help us understand what it means to be God's image. And that is this analogy of family or kinship. Just like Adam had a son in his likeness, so God had children in his likeness. And that is man and woman, male and female, who bear his image or who are his image. And so this passage in Genesis 5 gives us a little bit more of a taste of what it means to be the image of God. So here are our takeaways. To be God's image is a representative role. We physically, by our physical embodied existence, we represent God's rule on earth. It implies kinship with God. We share a family resemblance to him. We are, in fact, part of his royal family. We signal his presence to the rest of creation. And the purpose of us being in God's image is to carry out his good purposes in and for the world. So given Genesis 1 and its emphasis on bringing order to creation and allowing living things to flourish, a core part of what it means to be human is for us to maintain the flourishing of this created world, to be stewards of God's good creation and to carry on his work. In Genesis 2, we see God pass the baton on to Adam and invite Adam to name the animals. And God stands by to see what Adam is going to call them. There's a sense of true delegation. God's not micromanaging Adam. He's giving him a share in the creative work of rulership, and again of ensuring that the created world can flourish. So that, I think, tells us a bit about what it means to be human. Our mission as God's image is to cultivate and protect his good and to restore the fractured relationship between God and humanity, helping each person embrace this true identity. This is a high calling for all of us, and those of us who've devoted ourselves to full-time ministry especially can see around us people all the time who have a broken relationship with their families, with their communities, with creation, with themselves, and with God. And so we can see from this just brief portrait of what it means to be the image of God, that's not how we were designed to be. So the image has not been lost, but it's not being leaned into or lived out effectively. So the example that I like to use when I'm talking about this is a parent and child relationship. If you're a parent and you have a child who rebels against you and does not like, let's say they don't want to have a relationship with you anymore. They hate you. They move out. They start living a wild life, and they try to do everything the opposite of how you taught them to do it. No matter how egregious their behavior is, they never stop being your child. Our relationship as parent and child does not depend on having a good relationship. That kinship connection is there no matter whether we're feeling connected or not. And I think it's similar with humanity. There are lots of humans who are not living into the purpose God gave them, but that does not mean they're not God's image anymore. It means that they're not choosing to live in accordance with their true identity. They need to be restored to the right relationship with God. So that's some food for thought. I think this has big implications for how we treat one another. If every human being is the image of God and is capable of demonstrating, reminding of the presence of God and the rule of God, then how I treat every person matters. I can't brush someone off as being insignificant or not worthy of respect or not worthy of attention. All over the news this week is again the question of the unborn. And here in Canada, the other big question in the news is euthanasia. We're about to see probably a bill go into effect in Canada that would make it easier for physician-assisted suicide for anyone even for people who don't have a terminal illness. But if they are disabled or struggling with mental health or just have lost the will to live, then a doctor can help them into their life. And the unborn, those who feel like their quality of life isn't what it should be, are being eliminated. And so I think this teaching, the Bible's teaching about what it means to be God's image, speaks into this question of the sanctity of human life, the dignity of human life, no matter someone's age or ability or health. So that's some food for thought. Now I want to transition into this other concept of bearing God's name. Often I've seen writers, biblical scholars, or pastors blend these two ideas as though being made in God's image and bearing his name are like the same thing, just two ways of saying the same thing. And I would argue they're not, because every human being is the image of God, but not every human being bears God's name, at least not yet. So we're going to begin our discussion of bearing God's name, maybe in an unlikely place, with the instructions in Exodus 28 for how to dress the high priest. Because here's a man who literally bears God's name. We're told that Aaron on his forehead is going to wear this gold medallion, and it will be engraved like the engraving of a signet ring, wholly belonging to Yahweh. And they're supposed to fasten that plate on his turban with a blue cord, this wholly belonging to Yahweh. Here are the two words in Hebrew. It's just two words, kadosh la Yahweh. And there's the divine name that I've circled. It's the name Yahweh. And it's got this letter L attached to the front of it, la Yahweh, the lamed in Hebrew. And so that may seem a little bit odd. If you don't know Hebrew, then maybe it's not something you've given any thought to before. But this would have been the standard way of indicating ownership. So I've got a Bible here. If I wanted to let you know this was my Bible, I could write on the front, La Carmen. And you'd all know it was mine, right? Because you can read Hebrew. If I had a signet ring, a ring with a gemstone that was engraved with my name, I think virtually every example of signet rings we have from the ancient world that have someone's name on them, they all have this lamed in front of the name, belonging to. So my signet ring would say La Carmen, and if I stamped it in wax or clay, it would let you know that that thing is authorized by me or belongs to me. And that's exactly what the high priest has on his forehead, and he's even told, like the engraving of a signet. It's as though, it's kind of in this imaginative world, as though God himself has a signet ring, and it says Yahweh on it, and he's stamping it on Aaron's forehead. Everyone know, this guy is my appointed representative. He is going to mediate between me and the people who belong to me. So that's Kadosh Yahweh. The high priest also has other names that he wears. On his chest, he has this breastpiece with 12 precious stones on it, and they too are engraved like the engravings of a signet with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then on his shoulders, he has 2 big onyx stones with 6 names on each one. Whichever artist made this particular representation that I'm showing you here left off the lamed in front of all the names. It should be on there, because what this says is that the tribes of Israel each have a share in his ministry. Every single person, every single tribe is represented by Aaron's work. They have authorized him to do their work. And yes, I just saw Dan's comment in the chat that it reminds you of Revelation. All those who belong to God are marked as his. And yes, we will get there. That's exactly what's going on. So Aaron is wearing Yahweh's name on his forehead, and he's bearing the names of the tribes on his person as he goes in and out of the tabernacle. He's representing God to the people, and he's representing the people to God. Really exciting stuff. Okay, so we know the high priest wears God's name or bears God's name, but there's this really wonderful moment in Numbers 6, 22 to 27, where God gives Moses instructions for all the priests and tells them how they're to bless the people in the course of their ministry. The blessing is something that happened daily in the tabernacle. After the daily sacrifices were done on behalf of the whole community, the priests would come out and bless the people. You can read that whole scenario and how it plays out in Leviticus chapter 9, which is the priest's first day on the job. They have sacrifices for themselves first so that they can represent the people, then sacrifices for the whole community, and then they come out and they pronounce a blessing. But Leviticus 9 doesn't tell us the content of their blessing. To get the content, we have to go to Numbers chapter 6, where God prescribes what that blessing will be. And he says, "Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, thus you are to say to the Israelites, say to them, may Yahweh bless you and protect you. May Yahweh smile at you and be gracious to you. May Yahweh show you favor and grant you peace. So they shall set my name on the Israelites, and I myself will bless them." Most of us have heard this blessing before in some form or another at the end of a church service. It makes a wonderful benediction, but most of us have not hung out long enough to hear verse 27. So they shall set my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them. This is the moment when Aaron pronounces Yahweh's name over the people. It's as though then you could just sort of imagine God's name floating through the air and landing on each of their heads. This is the moment during which Yahweh is claiming these people as his covenant people who belong to him, because of the sacrifices that have been performed to cleanse them and make them a holy nation, a nation in relationship with him. They now bear his name. His name has been placed upon them. We'll see lots of evidence of this throughout the Old Testament. It's so much fun. Once you see this theme, it doesn't matter where you're reading, you're going to run into it. But one example is from Deuteronomy 26, verses 18 and 19. "And Yahweh has had you declare yourselves this day to be his treasured people, just as he said to you. So you shall keep his commands, and he shall set you high over all the nations that he has made, for praise, for fame, and for honor, and to be a people wholly belonging to Yahweh your God, just as he said." So the words that I've put in red there are the same words that are appearing on the high priest's forehead. Instead of just wholly belonging to Yahweh, it's a people wholly belonging to Yahweh. The entire nation is Kadosh Yahweh. They have been set apart as belonging to God. It's as though they all have an invisible tattoo that makes them match the high priest. And therefore, that the high priest is like a visual model, like a concrete model of what's true of the entire nation. He wears clothes that signal that he belongs to God, that he's set apart for God's service. But God has told the entire nation that they are set apart for his service, that they are his treasured people. So this is why I think Moses tells them, as part of the 10 Commandments, you shall not bear the name of Yahweh your God in vain. The Hebrew does not say, most of our English translations say, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, or you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. But the Hebrew literally says, lo tisa, do not lift or carry the name of Yahweh your God in vain. And most translators have come to this and been a little confused and said, well, we don't carry names, so this must mean something else. Like it must mean you shall not carry God's name on your lips, like say it. But there's nothing in this verse that limits the application to speaking God's name. And when we look at these other passages I've already pointed out in the context at Sinai, about the high priest bearing God's name, and about him conferring God's name on the people, I think the meaning is quite clear. God is telling his people, you belong to me. Therefore, do not misrepresent me to the nations. Do not live in such a way that you demonstrate to the nations something false about who I am. Don't claim to belong to me and then live like your pagan neighbors. So if you've thought in the past that this command was prohibiting swearing or using God's name as a swear word, or taking oaths in God's name, or pronouncing it in a certain way, we're not getting rid of those interpretations, but they fall under this wider umbrella of bearing the name. Bearing God's name is so much more than what we say or how we swear. Whether we're taking oaths or the language that slips out of our mouth when somebody cuts us off on the freeway. This is not the essence of what it means to bear God's name, but it would be included under the umbrella of things that would, if somebody cut me off and I used God's name as a swear word, clearly I'm not representing him well. My attitude and my words are not representing him well. So it would still fall under this umbrella, but it's so much bigger than this. It has to do with how I treat people, how I interact with others, how I pay my employees, or how I respond to my boss, how I parent my children, how I drive, how I dress, the way I conduct relationships with people. It's so much bigger. How I handle my finances. All of this falls under the umbrella of what it means to bear God's name. So now I just want to back up one more chapter to Exodus 19. We've been working through the Torah in reverse, because this is the other piece that makes me convinced that the name command is not prohibiting a certain kind of speech, but is prohibiting a way of misrepresenting God. The idea that Israel represents God is not something I'm importing into this verse, but it's something right here from the get-go. The very first thing God says to the Israelites when they arrive at Mount Sinai is this: you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. This is so significant for lots of reasons. First, let me point out that the fact that they're called a kingdom of priests justifies the idea of seeing the high priestly model of their vocation. If they are a kingdom of priests, then we'd want to look at the priests to find out what is it they're supposed to be doing in relation to the nations. This is entirely unique in the ancient world. We don't know of any other nations that thought of themselves en masse as holy or consecrated to the gods set apart for priestly work. But the other thing I want to point out is this phrase, treasured possession, which is just one word in Hebrew, and it's my favorite Hebrew word, and that is segala. The word segala is not just a nice thing God's thinking up to say to make, try to cheer them up, try to give them a warm fuzzy. Segala is a technical term used in treaty contexts, not just in Israel, but also in sister languages. They have equivalent words for treaty contexts, and it refers to a specially selected covenant partner imbued with special responsibility to represent the sovereign or the king. So when God calls Israel his treasured possession, he's acknowledging he may have relationships with other nations as well, but Israel is his prized ambassador, chosen and set apart to represent him to the nations. And I believe that if we understand this, it helps all of the rest of the Old Testament law fall into place. If you've ever wrestled with why are there so many laws in the Old Testament? Why does God expect so much of his people? I mean, really, they were slaves in Egypt and he rescues them, and you would think he'd cut them a little slack. But like the first thing he says when they get to Sinai is all these rules that they have to do. And that strikes us as being sort of oppressive or a drag in some way. But if we understand that God is identifying the Israelites as the people who belong to him, whose task is to represent him among the nations, then it starts to make sense. If their job is to demonstrate the character of God to a watching world, then they need to know how to do this. What does it look like to demonstrate God's character in our agriculture, in our commerce, in our family relationships, in our sexual relationships? What does it look like to represent God by the way we eat and what we wear and how we engage with other nations? All of the laws that we see in the rest of the Pentateuch or the Torah are a way of fleshing out more specifically what it means to bear God's name among the nations, how they can live in such a way that God is honored, so that the other nations can watch them. They know that Yahweh has been working on behalf of these people. They know that. In fact, I'll give you an example. I'm teaching through the historical books right now with my students, and in Joshua chapter 2, the spies who check out the city of Jericho are having a conversation with Rahab, this prostitute who hides them. And she says to them this amazing testimony. She says in verse 8, in verse 9, I know that Yahweh has given you this land. Really? How does she know that? Are there prophets? Are there prophets in the land of Canaan? I don't think so. I think they've heard the news of what Yahweh's done on Israel's behalf, and they have concluded like the result is inevitable. I know that Yahweh has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For Yahweh your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. They are seeing God's mighty acts on Israel's behalf, and they're realizing Yahweh is not some local deity with limited powers. Yahweh is powerful enough to rescue the Israelites from Pharaoh in Egypt and all the gods of the pantheon in Egypt, to help them survive as they cross through the wilderness, to fight the kings of the Amorites and on the east side of the Jordan. And now they're getting ready to cross into the land, and she knows the handwriting's already on the wall. Yahweh's going to win this battle. And so this is an example, this is an early fulfillment of this promise to Israel, that the nations will be able to see them, to see that Yahweh's name has been placed on them, and that they will fear them. That passage we read from Deuteronomy 26. Rahab is demonstrating that it's coming true. Once we realize this is in the Old Testament, that this grand plan, this grand mission of God to demonstrate his character to a watching world, we're going to see it all over the place in some of the most familiar passages. So Psalm 23, we all know Psalm 23. It says, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what does God's name have to do with my paths of righteousness? If we understand that God has placed his name on the people, saying that they belong to him, then their ability to live a righteous life, their willingness to do the right thing and to keep on doing the right thing affects Yahweh's reputation. He has tied his reputation to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. And so when he leads them in right paths, his name is magnified. The nations can see what he is like and who he is. And when they go off the rails and they disobey him and they disregard the covenant and worship other gods and begin sacrificing their children to other gods and live in horrible ways, then God sends them into exile. And Ezekiel 36 tells us the implications of that. It says, for my people, when they had to go out of my land, they profaned my name everywhere they went. Everywhere they went, as they're dragged off into exile, people are like, well, yeah, Yahweh used to be the going thing, but not anymore. My God is stronger than their God. Yahweh must not be able to protect his people. So people the nations draw the wrong conclusion about Yahweh and his power when the Israelites disobey the covenant and suffer the consequences of that by going into exile. So all through the Old Testament is this theme of bearing God's name. One passage that comes up a lot, especially around election time, is I think it's 2 Chronicles 7:14. Might be 1 Chronicles, but I think it's 2 Chronicles. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, then I will hear from heaven and I will heal their land. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what does it mean they're called by my name? People don't call them Yahweh. No, they're the people over whom Yahweh's name has been proclaimed. He has put his name on them to claim them as his own. And because of that, when they pray to him, when they seek to be rightly related to him, he hears and he responds and he heals their land that has been profaned and corrupted with the filthy rags of their disobedience. As soon as their hearts turn towards him, God can begin to restore them to the missional role he had for them from the beginning, which was to demonstrate his power and his character to the nations. So we've talked about two themes, the idea of being God's image and bearing God's name. And I just want to show you how these two themes are connected in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. So this is a drawing, architectural blueprint, if you will, of the tabernacle. My husband drew this for me for my dissertation because he has experience and background in architectural drafting. So he did it to scale. And you'll notice that in the most holy place, precisely the place where we would expect for there to be an image, a statue of Yahweh. Instead, there are two stone tablets. And these two stone tablets contain duplicate copies of the 10 Commandments in which the people are told not to make an image, but rather to bear his name well. Not to make an image, not to bear his name in vain. So those two ideas are linked in the 10 Commandments, and they're right here at the center where we would expect an image to be. So the two are connected, and the high priest is the only one who's allowed into that room, and only once a year. And the high priest is the one who literally bears God's name on his forehead. So lots of convergences here of themes. In the New Testament, we see Jesus bringing these two themes together as well. We get a glimpse of it in Matthew chapter 6 when Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray. And he says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." I think I wondered when I was a kid why God's name would need to be hallowed. Like, isn't God's name already holy? Why would we need to pray that God's name would become holy as though it's lacking something? Well, if we are paying attention to this biblical theme of bearing God's name, and we notice that the prophets have lamented the fact that God's name has been profaned because the people were disobedient and went into exile, then it makes all kinds of sense for Jesus to say, hallowed be your name, because he looks around at a nation that is living in unfaithfulness to the covenant. And that is, excuse me, not representing God well to the nations. And he prays, Lord, may your name be hallowed again. May it be set apart as holy again, recognizing that the way that happens is through the obedience of the covenant people. So by praying, hallowed be your name, Jesus is, I believe, committing himself to living faithfully to the covenant. He understands that the only way God's reputation can be upheld is when the people of God live in such a way that he is honored. That's the mission of God in the Old Testament, and it's the mission as it plays out in the New Testament. I don't have a slide for this, but I think that what we're seeing at Sinai is the fulfillment or the carrying on of the same mission that God gave to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord, when he called Abram out of Ur, he said, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And here's the key, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And at Sinai, God begins to unveil how this is going to happen. This is going to happen because the people of God who bear his name are going to live in such a way that all the nations are drawn in. They see what God is like, and they are amazed and impressed, and they want in. That's how it works in the Old Testament. Then in the New Testament, of course, Jesus begins to send his disciples out to proclaim the message. After his resurrection, it goes from being a come and see kind of faith to a go and tell kind of faith. But the mission is the same. The mission is to live as though you really belong to God, as though you bear his name. I believe it's legitimate to connect Christians today with the covenant at Sinai and the promise and blessing to Abraham. And there are many reasons to do this. There are many passages we could look at, but my favorite is 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10. This, to me, it's crystal clear in this passage that we are part of this same covenant, drawn into relationship with God, because Peter is practically plagiarizing. In fact, just about every word of these two verses comes from Old Testament texts that are just echoing and resonating with each other. He says, but you are a chosen people. And let me first say, Peter is not just writing to Jewish believers. He is writing to a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles who are scattered throughout the Roman world. They're scattered throughout modern day Turkey, Asia Minor. And he tells them, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This is a conglomeration of all kinds of texts, but the ones I have in orange here are titles lifted straight from Sinai and slapped onto the New Testament church. Peter sees followers of Jesus as the people who are set apart as God's segula, the people who bear his name and represent him to the nations. And he goes on to say, since you belong to Christ, here's how you should live. Notice that all the New Testament epistles do this. They don't do away with the idea of obedience. They don't call it law in the same way that we get at Sinai, but Paul and Peter and the other writers often will spend the first half of their letter talking about, here's what's true about you now that you belong to God. And the second half of their letter is usually devoted to, now here's how you shall live. Because as someone who belongs to God, here's how it works its way out in family relationships, in church structure and order, in society, with relation to the government. Here is how to live out your identity as the people who belong to me. But all of that idea, that concept of moving from exposition to exhortation, from here's what's true about you and now here's how you shall live, this is all rooted in what we see at Sinai. You are the people who belong to me, therefore here's how you should live. So our mission as God's name bearers is to represent God among the nations by bearing his name, our lives reflecting God's character and good purposes for the world. If the church could recover this, what a world this would be. We often kind of operate on two different extremes. There's the one side where we think of faith as being very personal and private and individual. That my faith in Jesus is my knowledge of who he is and what he did for me, and my trust in him that allows me to go to heaven when I die. It's very individual. But the biblical story is always and everywhere inviting people into something much bigger than that, inviting people into a community of faith whose task and vocation is to represent God to the nations by how they live and by what they say. So if we can help the church recover this mission, the church will be so much more effective. So on the one extreme, we have people who are thinking of faith as individual. And on the other extreme, we have people who are trying to implement, I'm thinking of a good way to say this, that won't be too inflammatory. People who are trying to, maybe I'll say it this way, people who have kind of merged in their mind the United States and ancient Israel. And they're trying to implement Old Testament laws or biblical teaching as part of the policy of our nation. This, I think, is equally problematic. Blurring the lines between the people of God and the kingdoms of this world is just as unhelpful as, and failing to see the difference between them is just as unhelpful as missing the fact that we're a community of faith, that God calls us to live well and to represent him well among the nations. When God is drawing his people into relationship with him at Sinai, he is their king, and they are a theocracy. They can set up a whole society according to the laws that God has given because he is their ruler. But in the New Testament, the people of God are under Roman occupation. And notice that Jesus doesn't come and he doesn't say, okay, we either throw out the Romans or we have to change their laws. No, he doesn't do that. He teaches his people how to live an alternative story while they're in the midst of a world with very worldly empires and rulers over them. He's not trying to throw off other rule. In fact, that's what they had hoped the Messiah would do. They hoped that the Messiah would come and deliver them from Roman rule, but he doesn't. He delivers them from their sin, and he helps them recover their purpose as the people of God, living in a world where other people are in control. One example that I think works fairly well for this idea of bearing God's name is the idea of athletics. So I teach at Prairie College in Three Hills, Alberta. This year, of course, we don't have any athletic teams playing like most schools everywhere. Because of the pandemic, we don't get to do this. But in a year when we are playing sports, our teams wear jerseys that identify them with our school. If they go, let's say they go to an away game, and let's say our basketball team has a really tough match with another school, and let's say they lose the match, and they're really angry about how they were treated on the court. And so after the game is over, they refuse to shake hands with the other team, and they start pushing them around, and a big fight breaks out. that's not just a reflection on these individual athletes. Because they wear the jerseys of Prairie College, that would reflect negatively on Prairie College. They bear our name, therefore they represent us. So people would, if our team had a habit of just coming unglued when they're in the middle of an athletic competition, they would then bring negative vibes about Prairie College. The school's reputation would suffer. So this is something that's so important for us to grab. And in a far deeper way, in a way in which there's a lot more at stake, I think we've seen in recent weeks the example of what it looks like to bear that, what the potential implications are of bearing God's name in the public square in ways that bring the name of God into disrepute. So we had just 3 weeks ago the insurrection of the Capitol building, in which there was this very strange blend of crosses and Bibles and flags saying "Make America Godly Again," alongside flags supporting President Trump, and alongside violence, Confederate flags, anti-Semitic comments, white supremacist comments. Like, there was a very confusing mix of people at the Capitol, and I don't want to blame the whole thing on everyone who was there, but there was some very troubling blending of Christian symbols and symbols in support of one candidate paired with violence. And I think that this is a time when we as a church need to stop and ask ourselves, how are we bearing God's name? Is this behavior by those carrying Christian symbols in the public square, is this representing the character of God, or is it distorting the world's vision of who God is and what matters to him? It's a sobering moment for our nation. So I would love to take your questions, and I'd love to have even just a wider discussion on what implications this has, the idea of being God's image and bearing God's name. What are the implications for the identity and vocation of believers in Jesus? What implications does this have for your ministry or your context? What does it have for your engagement with a wider culture, including politics and creation care? I'll open the chat now and see what some of you have been saying.
Thank you so much, Dr. Imes. This has just been wonderful, and I'm sure that we'll have some questions coming in, and I'll try to help moderate those for you. Again, if you'd like to ask a question on screen, if you want to come on, just note in the chat box that you'd like to do that. If you'd like me to read the question, write that into the Q&A section, and we can do that. Perhaps
Can I just say a word about Dan's comment earlier that I mentioned and then didn't end up talking about, and that was he noted in the book of Revelation that those who belong to God are marked as his. And this is what I find so fascinating in the book of Revelation is that the people of God have had this invisible tattoo, if you will, or invisible mark all through history since Sinai. God's put his name on them, but it's not actually visible. It's invisible, but people know they belong to God. And yet in John's vision in the book of Revelation, what has been invisible becomes visible. And so we're told that the 144,000 faithful people have the name of the Father, the name of Jesus, and the name of Yahweh on their forehead. And so it's like the invisible becomes visible. But we also have the mark of the beast. And so everyone in John's vision either has the name of Yahweh or the mark of the beast on their bodies. And I think it's showing us that those who have allied themselves with this world system also bear a name, but they've chosen a different name to bear, and that is the mark of the beast. There's a lot of talk these days about the mark of the beast. It sort of comes in waves in each generation, and the latest scare is if you get the coronavirus vaccine, is that the mark of the beast? And I just think if you have been paying attention to the idea of bearing God's name in Scripture, then you will not have the least bit of worry that the coronavirus vaccine is the mark of the beast. You can have a separate conversation about whether vaccines are the right response to this, or, you know, I'm not saying everybody has to go get a vaccine right now. I'm not a scientist, but I am saying I don't have any theological problem with the vaccine, because I don't think it's about having this like secret DNA being entered into your body, or this secret code being implanted in you somehow, as though somebody's sneaking. There's no way to sneak allegiance to the beast. It comes through how you live and where you've allied yourself. Just like you can't sneak allegiance to Yahweh. It's something that the Bible calls us to do publicly and conspicuously. All right, over to you, Judd.
I've heard many of your colleagues say, I am a doctor, and so I can say that the vaccine is not the mark of the beast. And what I mean by that is I am a doctor in theology.
Yes.
And that allows me to say that.
Yes, exactly.
Something that I think you already addressed when you brought in Peter, but perhaps we can flesh this out a little bit. One of the questions that we have, not that we replace Israel, but does that extend to us as the true Israel in the Pauline way of thinking?
Yes, I believe that what happens at Sinai extends to us as the true Israel, not that we've replaced Israel, but I believe that in Jesus, we have been incorporated into this covenant. So I don't look at the church as replacing Israel, but the church as being given an on-ramp to the covenant through Jesus. And then, of course, someone who's ethnically Jewish, who has rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and does not live faithfully, then they have an off-ramp from the covenant, right? They disqualify themselves. I see that that's what's going on as I read it in Romans 9-11, that Paul is redefining what is meant by Israel. Not all who are descended from Abraham are true Israel. There's a remnant of those who've actually lived faithfully to the covenant. And Jesus is one of those in that remnant, through whose faithfulness we get incorporated in because of our faith in him.
Are you using faithfulness there, maybe the way that N.T. Wright would use it, the faithfulness of God?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Okay. I'm a fan of Wright.
Another question we have here, what are other resources for this material? It is certainly powerful and relevant, but a different perspective for many of us.
So other resources that would sort of support what I'm saying. I mean, we've talked about my book, Bearing God's Name. So this would flesh out more fully what I've shared today with more examples, more passages, and giving you more of the bigger picture. If you wanted to see more like academic, well-researched justification for it, my dissertation's been published as Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, a re-examination of the name command of the Decalogue. I do not recommend this if you're not a biblical scholar. My husband's grandma bought a copy. I think she wanted to support me and be proud of me or something. And she was really quite upset because she couldn't understand it. She said, I knew I wouldn't be able to understand the Hebrew, but I couldn't even understand the English. It's very technical. But if you've been to seminary or you've spent any time with biblical languages, then it should be accessible enough for you. The reason I wrote Bearing God's Name was because I thought these ideas were really important and the church needed to get a hold of them. So I represented it in a way that the wider church can access. And Grandma actually gave away her copy of the book. She was so upset. So I don't mind if you don't buy that one. But if you're a scholar and you want more justification, that's the place to look. There's work being done these days that I think is really helpful. I'm thinking of Matthew Bates, his book, Gospel Allegiance. I've had many people, I haven't made it all the way through his book, but I've had many people who've read both of our books say that they fit really well together. Matthew Bates is basically saying that becoming a Christian is not just about intellectually assenting to certain doctrinal truths about Jesus, but it's actually surrendering ourselves in allegiance to Jesus as King. That's what the New Testament presents as the gospel. And that fits really well with what I've done in the Old Testament, working up to the New Testament. So that's another resource, Gospel Allegiance.
I might play off that last question and ask, in growing up in the church and hearing the commandments, the commandment, don't take the Lord's name in vain, was never one that I struggled with. Here's a clear ruling. If you stub your toe, here's what not to say.
Right.
How did we miss this? It's not as though this is a difficult text that we've struggled with, and you've solved the riddle for us. It seems like it's an easy text that somehow we've taken in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Yes. This is a text that I think is so. Let me back up by saying some have suggested to me, how could your reading of the name command be right? It's so broad that it feels like it doesn't even belong in the 10 Commandments. Like it covers everything. Like, don't bear God's name in vain is like everything. So isn't that a little too broad when we have in the 10 Commandments some really specific things like not stealing and not murdering and not bearing false witness? Like, shouldn't this also be specific? And I would argue, and I explain why in the book, that the first command is the command not to worship other gods. And that, number one, includes within it not worshiping idols. So making an idol and worshiping another god would have gone hand in hand. So that's command number one. And then what I'm calling the name command, not bearing God's name in vain, is number two. And I believe that these two commands are like the head of the rest of the 10. And it's an expression of the covenant formula that we see over and over again in the prophets, which is, then I will be your God and you will be my people. So I will be your God, don't worship other gods. You will be my people, don't bear my name in vain. You belong to me, so live like it. So I think it's far more programmatic and broader than we've read it. And I think the problem has come when people want to sort of, just tell me exactly what I don't have to, what not to do. Like, I don't want to break this. And so they try to constrain it to like a checklist. And this is much bigger than what would fit on a checklist. There's a whole chapter in my dissertation on the history of interpretation. And I don't have as comprehensive of an explanation of how we got there, but I spend a lot of time showing why the other views don't quite work exegetically. Like they actually don't work in Hebrew very well. So it's amazing to me that this misunderstanding became so widespread. But I am not the first one to suggest this. I actually didn't even come up with the idea myself. It was an idea from my doctoral mentor, Daniel Block. And I found representatives throughout history who read this command in this way, but they were always a minority. And that's a little baffling to me, because to me, it's the more time I spend with it, the more obvious it seems.
Daniel Block, who's not only an excellent scholar, but one of the kindest human beings on the planet.
He is.
I think
he's so kind.
All right, this next question is about as broad as you can get, so you can take it in any direction you want, I think. What might be the implications of all of this for conversation among one another who are bearers of God's image?
Yeah, I think we need to recover a way of talking to each other respectfully. That's just the bare minimum that I feel like our public discourse, and by public, I'm thinking within the church, but with people who disagree with each other within the church, our public discourse has broken down and become more and more polarized over these past years. And I think that we need to recover the idea that every single human being is the image of God, and every other believer in Jesus bears God's name. Therefore, our job is actually to bear God's name together collectively. Like, we're together chosen for this task. And if we can't learn how to do it together, then we're missing the essence of the gospel. So this is the challenge of our day. People who are on the opposite end of the political spectrum from you, how can you build bridges with them? How can you restore conversation so that we can not just build community with each other, but model to the world the love that we have for each other?
Absolutely. All right, we're going to attempt to pull Anthony onto the screen so he can ask a question.
All right.
As we're waiting for him to get his video and audio on, I'll say one of the things that I learned today is I've spent far too much time on Facebook this week. When you put up the picture of the basketball team, the first thing I did is I said, okay, where's Bernie?
That's great. I have to say, he has united the nation, hasn't he, this week?
All right, Anthony, the floor is yours.
Just two things very quickly. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Imes. The fact is, I've been listening to you since I was first introduced to you at Remnant Radio.
Okay.
Got a chance to listen to that interview. And since then, I've been looking for you at any YouTube video I can find for interviews and such. And every time I hear it, I learn something, but there's also just a sense that you're bringing something weighty, something significant to the church. And so I just want to convey appreciation for that.
Thank you.
The other thing is I want to ask something that goes back to the beginning of your lecture here regarding the divine image that we have. But my sense, or my understanding of the fact that we are created in the image of God has always been something like this. Like, clearly, observation shows us that humans are animals. We're part of the animal kingdom. We have a lot of the same design, right? We have the circulatory system, reproductive, respiratory, digestive. We are definitely animals. At the same time, we transcend the animals.
Yes.
And my understanding is that area of transcending the animal kingdom has also been what we would call the image of God. And because we're so for example, we create like the creator. I mean, animals that make things don't really create. That's why spider webs are the same everywhere all the time. And beaver dams are the same everywhere all the time. Whereas we create things differently in different places from different people, and we develop things.
Yeah.
So we're creative. I think we recognize beauty and ugliness. We recognize utility and worthlessness in ways that the animals don't. And all of that has been my understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about the divine image, moral reflection, self-reflection. We look at ourselves, we ask questions about ourselves. Now, you said something near the beginning where you said the divine image isn't any of our abilities, but that it's our bodies.
Yes.
Now, so I just want to poke at that and see what's there.
Sure.
Are you saying that in terms of a replacement for the more traditional understanding, or are you saying that this is something that we need to kind of add to our understanding?
That's a
our
great
classic
question.
understanding of the image of God and how we are created in the image of God.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me first say that when I wrote Bearing God's Name, I was drawing on 8 years of my own doctoral work and master's work. And so it just, like when I wrote that book, it just came pouring out of me, and it was really, really easy to write. It felt like pushing a boulder downhill. It was like, this is what I was born to write. Writing the book on being God's image has been a very different process because I'm busy reading everybody else's dissertations that I haven't been sitting with as long and haven't explored as deeply myself. But I have spent a fair bit of time with these other dissertations. And so here's the thing that's emerging to me is that there are ethical and theological problems in attaching the image to any of those capacities that you mentioned. It is true. We are more creative as a whole, more creative and more observant and more appreciative of beauty than the animals. But there are many exceptions to the rule. And so for a human that's profoundly disabled, or for a human who just kind of lacks self-awareness or lacks creativity, I want to affirm that person is no less the image of God. So there are some potential ethical issues with attaching image to a certain ability. I would say that what you described is, it reflects somehow the kinship that we have with God, that we have this sort of elevated set of capacities, but that the image itself is more more rightly expressed, I think, as our identity, like who we are is the image. And then there are sort of other implications that roll out from that. So there I'm drawing on the work of Ryan Peterson, who wrote a, let me step over and grab a couple books. I'll be right back. Okay, so Ryan Peterson's dissertation is the Imago Dei as Human Identity. He's a theologian. He did his PhD at Wheaton College like I did, but he did it from a theological perspective. And he's arguing that Scripture teaches this is the essence of who we are. It's not lost at the fall. And then the idea of the image of God as kinship with God, I get from Catherine McDowell's dissertation, The Image of God in the Garden of Eden. She does a lot of comparison with ancient Near Eastern texts and says that the moment when God breathes life into Adam's lungs, gives him breath, that's animating him in the same way that ancient Near Eastern people tried to animate the idols that they would put in their temples. And so she draws an analogy between these Mesopotamian and Egyptian rituals and what we see in the biblical text, that's basically showing Adam as a concrete, or Adam and Eve as concretely living out the image, or they are the image animated by God, appointed for a task. And then maybe the most illuminating is Richard Middleton's The Liberating Image, where he talks about how rulership is not the image itself, but it's an implication of our status or identity as God's image. And he talks about how that rulership needs to be expressed in ways that provide for human flourishing and the flourishing of the natural world. So it's never dominating or exploitative. So I don't know if that was enough of an answer to your question.
No, that was very helpful. I appreciate that. Can I respond? And then
yes,
and then I'll back away. I don't want to dominate them. But I recognize what you're saying about the ethical problems, because I can't remember who it was. It was one of the neo-Orthodox writers who mentioned, who was referring to the fact that most people in his circles were talking about how our ability to reason was the image of God. He said that the ethical problem there was that there were people that he would visit in the hospital who were no longer capable of reason. Were they no longer human? And of course, his answer to that was, of course not.
Right.
Now, so the ethical problem has always been there. I think, though, if we recognize that the reference that the image of God is given to humanity as a whole, I think that the ethical problem kind of dissolves a little bit. Also, I think that there's that, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to formulate my ideas and my question at the same time, so I apologize. But I think it dissolves when you recognize the divine image given to us as a corporate entity of humanity. And I also think that, I don't know, I'll say that I'm very happy to bring into that an understanding that our bodies are out representing God in our capacity, in our original capacity to kind of like be deputies on the rest of creation.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to lose the former stuff. I think that there are ways around the ethical problems there.
Yes. I agree with you that when we think of the image as something corporately shared by all humans, that does lessen the ethical issue. I was on a podcast called Two Christians and a Jew. About a month ago it came out, and that was I went on that podcast as a learner, not a teacher. I wanted to ask the a Jewish man on the podcast for his take on how do Jews understand the image of God. And that was what he told me. We don't have this ethical problem because we think of the image as corporate. So what you're saying doesn't really bother us the way it's bothering you. I'm getting the ethical problem from John Kilner, whose dissertation is also over there, but I didn't grab it. It's called Dignity and Destiny. And he's done really good work on why it's important to affirm that the image has not been lost or destroyed at all. But maybe I would say this, going back to Genesis 1:26-28, I don't see any evidence in the text there when image is being unveiled that it has anything to do with our rational capacity or our moral capacity. When I look at that text, what I see is the word selim, which implies this concrete image, and the implications for representing God in terms of being physically present in creation. And so to me, the most natural way to read that text is not to foreground our capacities. But I'm certainly not denying that we have lots of capacities beyond what the animals have. I just don't think that's not the hook I would hang our image on. But I would say, yes, there are other things that are true of humans, and that God has endowed us with above and beyond the animals. And that I think comes to the fore in other texts in the Old Testament. And I'm thinking of Ecclesiastes, and it's wrestling with human vocation, and animals don't have these sorts of wrestlings the way we do. And I am spending a chapter on that in my book, just the intellectual quest and the quest for wisdom in Proverbs, the human expression of prayer and lament. And there's lots of dimensions of what it means to be human. I don't want to reduce it just to we're bodies and that's all that matters.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your great question.
So a question that I'm sure as an Old Testament professor you get asked often as you're talking about the image of God being corporate and then relating that to ethical issues of the day and sanctity of life. In the Old Testament, that means that the Midianites and the Moabites and the Canaanites are made in the image of God. How do we deal with God's commands to his people on how to treat them?
Yes. That's a great question. I don't like the conquest, as many people don't. And we're actually studying it this week in my historical books class. So it's going to be hard to give a short answer to that.
I reckon.
But I'll say a couple of things that are helpful to me when I think about the conquest. And maybe conquest is actually not the right word, but anyway, the entry into the land of the Israelites. They are obeying the command of God, who has set aside this land as the place in which his people will demonstrate his character to a watching world. And so he cleanses it first. And the cleansing of the land has to do with, they are a holy nation. And so the land has to be cleared of its blasphemy, of the ways that Yahweh has been dishonored. And so the other nations are not being pursued and killed because they are another ethnic group. They are being pursued because they have worshiped false gods. They have sacrificed their children in the fire. They have not honored each other. And so there's a need to cleanse the land so that Israel can live there without getting caught up in the worship of other gods. What I like to do with students is reread Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 12, Exodus 23, the places before they get to the land where God says, here's what you're going to do when you get there. And so I would encourage you to read those chapters, the sections that talk about going into the land, and watch for blood. And what's striking to me is that there isn't any. They're driving them out, but often it says that the Lord will drive them out from before them. So they're fleeing from the land rather than being struck down in the land. The thing that's being destroyed when the Israelites get there, the things they're told to destroy, are the altars, the sacred stones, the Asherah poles, any place where a God's name has been inscribed as a claim of ownership. That's what's being demolished, not people. So that helps me a little bit with these texts that are difficult. The Israelites are clearing out space for the people of God. It's a limited time. There's a limited time during which they are supposed to be doing this. It's not a mandate that we take up in our generation, and it's a response to the sin of these nations and the need for cleansing in the land. And it doesn't need to involve blood if the people leave willingly, or if they turn around and convert, like we see Rahab saying, I want to be on Yahweh's team, like take me and my family. And she actually becomes part of the family line of Jesus. So I don't see this as a racist. These are not racist texts. They are religious in nature. And that helps me a little bit, but it doesn't probably go all the way towards answering the really good question.
We could spend an hour and a half on just that.
We could. I do have a short video on my YouTube channel where I talk about Canaanite genocide, and I do it a little better justice than what I just did.
Thank you. How does this understanding of image relate to the thought of being made in the image of the triune God? By that, I mean the usage of the word Elohim for God somehow lends to us also being triune, as in Genesis 2:7 and 1 Thessalonians 5:23 as two examples.
Good question. I think my next Torah Tuesday video coming out is the one where I talk about the communal dimension of being the image of God. So God says, let us make mankind in our image. There's a corporateness even to his initiation of this idea of making humans. I don't see that let us as a Trinitarian reference. I see that as a reference of Yahweh speaking to the divine council. His angelic hosts are around him, and he's bringing them into his creative deliberations, just like he's bringing Adam into his creative work by allowing him to name the animals. And he's bringing the man and the woman into his work by asking them to care for the garden and guard it. So there's a communal nature to being God's image from the very beginning. I would hesitate to attach this directly to the word Elohim being plural, because grammatical gender and grammatical number, singular or plural, doesn't always correspond to reality. I do believe in the Trinity. I just don't think that the Trinity is clearly revealed in the Old Testament. And I would also be hesitant to say that we as people are triune in some way. I know that it's common to talk about us having a body, soul, and spirit, but I actually don't see that well supported in Scripture. In the Old Testament, the soul, or nephesh, nephesh is a way of referring to a whole person, like including their body. You can even have a dead nephesh. Animals can be called nafshim. So I hesitate to make strict delineations between body, soul, and spirit. And I would commend the Bible Project video on Nephesh to anyone who's interested in more on that. It's in their word study series on the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4-9. And they have one on soul that's really good.
All right, thank you. Is there a difference between the image of God and an imitator of God, as mentioned in Ephesians 5:1?
Yes, I think, again, every human being is the image of God, and we are called to be imitators of God, but you can be God's image without imitating him well, just like my child can be my child without actually obeying me. So when we're called to imitate God, I think it's a call actually to bear his name well. And by bearing his name well, I think we're leaning more fully into our identity as the people who are God's image and bear God's name.
I was thinking about when you started with Exodus 28 and Aaron bearing the name, and then a few chapters later, he's throwing gold into a fire to see what will come out.
Yeah.
There
Yes.
seems to be a sense of how well is he bearing the name,
Yes.
even in those early goings.
Definitely. And he doesn't lose that status of a name bearer. Just popping up this last slide here as we get to the end of our time, in case you needed to get the title of one of my books, you can watch for the book on the image of God probably about a year from now. And I'm also very active online, as Judd mentioned earlier. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter. I have a blog. I'm on Goodreads. You can see always what I'm reading and how I'm reviewing those books. And then I have a YouTube channel. So find me. Some of you, I think, asked questions in the chat that we didn't get to. So if you want to track me down another way with your question, feel free to do that.
All right. Well, once again, Dr. Imes, thank you so very much for this. This has been a wonderful time. On behalf of the Commission on Credentialing and Placement, it's my pleasure that we can do these kinds of things. And we have 2 more opportunities coming up in the next 2 Mondays. Next Monday, 1 week from today, Dr. Vincent Baycote of Wheaton College is going to be speaking on loving God and his world, holistic discipleship without public idolatry. And then 2 weeks from today, Dr. Sidney Park, who teaches at Beeson Divinity School, will be speaking on taking up the cross and following Christ. And so again, as we continue to think about what does it mean to bear God's name and be his image and follow Jesus as disciples, I think that these future lectures as well will help us to continue to think along those themes. And I certainly hope that you will plan on joining us for those as well. Thank you to all of you who participated today and who attended. I hope you were as blessed as I was. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Imes, for spending this time with us, especially on a busy day. Dr. Imes is going to go from us to teach 2 classes and then do another podcast today. Thank you so much for your willingness to
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. This has been a pleasure. Blessings to all of you.
God's blessings to all of you. Go in peace.